evening, I'm Katie Wilson and you're watching AnewZ. Let's see your headlines. Russia and Ukraine conduct a major prisoner swap agreed during Istanbul talks. President Trump says he will impose new tariffs on the European Union. The US and Iran conclude another round of talks in Rome. Russia and Ukraine began a large-scale prisoner exchange on Friday, with each side releasing 390 captives. The swap, expected to span 3 days, is set to become the biggest of the war so far. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the process would continue through the weekend. Ukraine's defense minister pledged that all Ukrainian prisoners of war would be returned. The deal to exchange 1,000 prisoners each was the only tangible outcome from face-to-face talks in Istanbul last week, marking the first direct negotiations between the two sides in over 3 years. President Vladimir Putin says Russia is establishing a buffer zone along its border with Ukraine. The announcement follows Putin's visit to the border region at Kursk and a phone call with President Trump. Both leaders discussed peace prospects, with Putin thanking Trump for backing resumed talks between Moscow and Kyiv. Putin claims the war is now on a path towards resolution and says the move is aimed at enhancing security. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has downplayed the possibility of the Vatican playing a mediating role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, calling it an inelegant solution.
Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has cast doubt over the Vatican as a potential location for peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. This comes after Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni said that Pope Leo XIV had confirmed his willingness to host talks during a phone call. Pope Leo, the first US-born pontiff, stated soon after his election this month that the Vatican could act as a mediator in global conflicts, without specifically mentioning Russia and Ukraine. Lavrov has called the solution inelegant and says it would put the Vatican in an uncomfortable position.
Imagine the Vatican as a venue for negotiations. It would be a bit inelegant for Orthodox countries to use a Catholic platform to discuss issues on how to remove the root causes of the conflict.
Ukraine, however, has expressed openness to the notion of the Vatican as host, but Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has also suggested Turkey and Switzerland as alternative venues. The Vatican said the idea of hosting or even mediating talks, which US President Donald Trump suggested was an option, is more a hope for now than any concrete plan.
Finance ministers from G7 nations have concluded their summit in Banff, issuing a joint statement that underscores unity in tackling global economic challenges. While US tariffs were not explicitly mentioned, the Canadian finance minister emphasised that the discussions were open and constructive.
The G7 Finance Ministers' Summit in Banff in Canada ended Thursday with officials emphasising unity in addressing global economic challenges, despite underlying tensions over US tariffs and trade policies. The joint communiqué focused on combating non-market practices, implicitly referencing China's trade behaviours, and reaffirmed support for Ukraine, including maintaining sanctions against Russia.
We had very constructive and productive discussion. We understand that we need to reduce uncertainty in order to increase growth. I think, we went back to basics. For me, this G7 is back to basic, back to the core mission. Our mission, my mission when I entered the room, was really to promote stability and growth. And I would say of all the international meetings I've attended, this was one where you had frank discussion, that people shared views on different issues, but also there was a strong call to actions. We found common ground on a number of things. If you look at the communiqué.
While the communiqué did not directly mention US tariffs, Canadian Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne asserted that the issue was not avoided during discussions, highlighting the group's commitment to open dialogue.
There's no doubt that there's discussion around that policy of tariff by the United States, but I would say there's also a very constructive discussion about what's the way forward that we can adopt and where can we find common ground to tackle other global challenges. Canada is the biggest customer in the United States. I always say we buy more from the United States than China, Japan, the UK, and France combined. So it's quite normal when you meet your biggest customer that there's a lot to discuss, you know.
The summit sets the stage for the upcoming G7 leaders meeting in Kananaskis in Alberta on the 15th of June.
President Trump is threatening a 50% tariff on all European Union imports starting on June the 1st. He warned Apple, make iPhones in the US or pay a 25% tariff.
US President Donald Trump is stepping up trade pressure on two major fronts, the European Union and tech giant Apple, sparking new worries in global markets. Trump recommended a steep 50% tariff on all imports from the European Union, starting June 1st. The move comes amid stalled trade talks with the bloc, which Trump accused of taking advantage of the United States. The White House says the tariffs aim to address the US trade deficit with the EU, which topped $235 billion last year. At the same time, Trump said Apple will face a 25% tariff on iPhones sold in the US that are not made in the country. He informed Apple CEO Tim Cook that iPhones sold in the US must be manufactured domestically, not in countries like India or Vietnam. The president insists that to avoid the tariff, Apple must bring manufacturing back home. Experts warn these tariffs could drive up prices, with iPhones potentially costing hundreds or even thousands more. Markets reacted immediately. Wall Street opened sharply lower on Friday. The Dow Jones dropped over 330 points, while the S&P 500 and Nasdaq each fell more than 1%. Apple shares were down 2.5% at the open. In Europe, officials responded cautiously but firmly. French Trade Minister Laurent Saint-Martin called Trump's tariff threat unhelpful to ongoing talks and said the EU is ready to respond if needed. Meanwhile, Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof expects a calm but firm reaction from the European Commission, which is scheduled to speak with US trade representatives later today. German Economy Minister Katharina Reich warned that trade conflicts hurt both sides equally and urged the European Commission to work toward a negotiated solution, with the US-German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul said the European Commission has full backing from Berlin. He warned such tariffs would harm both economies and called for continued negotiations to protect the transatlantic trade relationship.
It is up to the European Commission to respond. It has our full support in maintaining our access to the American market, and I believe that such tariffs do not help anyone, but would only lead to economic development in both markets to suffer as a result. And that's why we continue to pursue negotiations and support the European Commission. We want to defend Europe and the European market while simultaneously exerting the power of persuasion in America.
The European Commission itself has asked for clarification on the tariff proposal before making any official response. As tensions rise, global markets are closely watching whether the EU and Apple will push back, and how these new tariffs could reshape global trade in the coming months.
European shares fell sharply on Friday after President Trump announced plans for major tariffs on the European Union. Traders say the announcement was a negative surprise for stock markets. After 5 straight weeks of gains, the Pan-European Stoxx 600 index fell 1.9% as traders are bracing for increased volatility. Meanwhile, experts warn that escalating economic hostility will harm both the US and the EU.
I think the European Union cannot cave in and should not try to appease Donald Trump at this point. The experience of the last couple of months is that this US president actually blinks. I mean, he actually gives in when faced with the major negative consequences of his actions. And so I think it's important to document and show that this is actually going to be very harmful for the US economy as well as for the European economy. Now, I think at the same time, I would not escalate it as the Chinese have done.
A Chicago-born man has been charged in a deadly shooting outside a Jewish museum in Washington, D.C. Elias Rodriguez faces multiple federal counts, including first-degree murder and murder of foreign officials. It comes after 2 Israeli embassy workers were killed after a diplomatic event hosted by the American Jewish Committee on Wednesday night. Authorities say the 30-year-old shouted "Free Palestine" during his arrest and is being investigated for possible hate crime and terrorism links. The victims were a young couple soon to be engaged. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accused Western leaders of supporting Hamas after they called on Israel to halt its Gaza offensive. The leaders reject the claims, urging more humanitarian aid amid Gaza's worsening crisis.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu criticised the leaders of France, Britain and Canada, accusing them of siding with Hamas after they jointly called for an end to Israel's latest military offensive in Gaza and the easing of restrictions on humanitarian aid. In a strongly worded video statement posted online, Netanyahu said the positions taken by French President Emmanuel Macron, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Canadian leader Mark Carney effectively supported Hamas.
I say to President Macron, Prime Minister Carney, and Prime Minister Starmer, when mass murderers, rapists, baby killers, and kidnappers thank you, you're on the wrong side of justice. You're on the wrong side of humanity, and you're on the wrong side of history.
The criticism follows a joint statement by the 3 leaders earlier this week, condemning Israel's actions in Gaza as disproportionate and urging more aid access amid a blockade since March. Netanyahu argued that such positions reward terrorism and give Hamas hope of establishing a second Palestinian state to destroy Israel. He linked the leaders' remarks to the recent killing of 2 Israeli embassy staff in Washington, calling it a result of anti-Israel rhetoric. Western leaders have rejected Netanyahu's accusations. French and Canadian officials also reiterated their commitment to Israel's security while calling for greater humanitarian access in Gaza.
Of course, we do not accept these accusations. Obviously, what happened in Washington was an anti-Semitic act, and we do not accept that either. We do not confuse the Israeli people with the policies being pursued today by Benjamin Netanyahu. You know the great, immense reservations we have, particularly regarding what is happening in Gaza. I think we must de-escalate this rising tension between our 2 states and work to find lasting peace solutions for Israel and Palestine.
Humanitarian agencies report that although some aid has recently been allowed into Gaza, it remains insufficient to meet the critical needs of the population.
The White House says that negotiations between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu about a deal with Iran were progressing in a positive direction after they spoke on Thursday. White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt told reporters that the deal with Tehran could end in one of 2 ways, either with a positive diplomatic resolution or with a much more negative outcome for Iran. Leavitt said the president was committed to pursuing diplomacy to avoid the latter scenario. However, Iran's foreign minister said that if the US insists on completely stopping uranium enrichment, there will be no deal.
It has made it very clear to not just Prime Minister
The 5th round of indirect negotiations between the United States and Iran over Tehran's nuclear program have concluded in Rome. Iranian and US negotiators resumed talks to resolve a decades-long dispute over Iran's nuclear ambitions. Both Washington and Tehran have taken a tough stance in public over Iran's intensifying uranium enrichment program, which could potentially give it scope to build a nuclear warhead, even though Tehran says it has no such ambitions. Climate activists stormed BNP Paribas in Paris, accusing the bank of fueling fossil fuel projects by French energy giant Total Energies. The protest comes amid rising investor pressure at the company's annual shareholders meeting for greater climate accountability.
Climate activists from Extinction Rebellion entered BNP Paribas Paris offices on Friday. A small group of protesters went into the building, staging their demonstration with fake banknotes and champagne before police removed them. They accuse the bank of financing TotalEnergies' fossil fuel expansion. Activists criticise the company's controversial projects, calling them an environmental and human rights disaster.
TotalEnergies is the emblem of companies that are harmful from a climate point of view with absolute cynicism. We must still remember that their oil extraction project in Uganda is a disaster, but not only an environmental one.
BNP Paribas condemned the protest as aggressive, but reaffirmed its commitment to supporting the energy transition. The demonstration happened during TotalEnergies' annual shareholders' meeting, where investors are demanding greater accountability on climate issues. Important issues include human rights and biodiversity related to the East African crude oil pipeline and upcoming fossil fuel projects in Mozambique and Namibia. In 2023, Bank faced similar protests and criticism for its role financing the pipeline. Activists criticised BNP Paribas of arranging an $8 billion loan to TotalEnergies to support various projects across Africa. That year, environmental groups also filed a lawsuit accusing the bank of worsening the climate crisis. Since then, BNP Paribas has pledged to stop investing in new oil and gas bonds, but critics say this is not enough. Activists vow to continue their fight, demanding banks cut ties with fossil fuels entirely to protect the planet's future.
The US government science agency has warned this year's incoming Atlantic hurricane season is expected to be busier than usual. That's just as cuts to American research are raising fears about the ability to track and prepare for these deadly storms.
The US is bracing for what could be another devastating hurricane season. Government scientists warn that the rate of storms in 2025 will be above normal, and it's expected to begin in just over a week's time. According to the National Weather Service, the US can expect up to 19 major tropical storms, with at least 6 to 10 of them becoming hurricanes. That's compared to around 7 in an average year. Last year was one of the costliest on record. 427 lives lost and $130 billion in damages. But experts say this year could be worse, with winds of at least 179 kilometers per hour expected. There are some concerns, though, of the US's ability to protect its citizens.
We need help to be able to really reach out to the communities to let them know the dangers of war.
Budget cuts by President Donald Trump's administration could endanger efforts to monitor these hurricanes and predict where they might hit. With hurricane season stretching all the way to November, preparations are already underway. And for many communities, it's not about bracing for the storm, but surviving its aftermath.
A federal judge has blocked the Trump administration's move to cut off Harvard's foreign student enrollment, a decision the university called unconstitutional and devastating. The ruling came just hours after Harvard filed an emergency lawsuit accusing the administration of political retaliation. The university warned that losing over 7,000 international students would strike at the heart of its identity and mission. The case now moves forward for further legal review. President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, welcomed interior ministers from the Organization of Turkic States in Baku. The meeting brought together high-level officials from Turkey, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Northern Cyprus, Hungary, and the OTS Secretariat. President Aliyev stressed the importance of unity among Turkic nations, saying the organization is built on shared roots, values, and growing economic strength. He highlighted the need for closer cooperation between interior ministries to ensure stability and counter external threats. The president also noted Azerbaijan's role in launching informal OTS summits, with the next official summit set to be hosted in the country later this year. The OTS Secretary-General thanked Azerbaijan, highlighting the growing cooperation across law enforcement and judicial platforms. Azerbaijan's ambassador to Brussels and Luxembourg said that meaningful and open discussions on political and security cooperation were discussed at the 6th European Union and Azerbaijan Security Dialogue in Brussels on Thursday. The meeting was co-chaired by Hikmet Hajiev, Assistant to the President of Azerbaijan, and Olaf Skog, Deputy Secretary-General of the European External Action Service. This meeting follows recent high-level engagements in Malta, Baku, Brussels and Tirana, underscoring the importance of regular dialogue amid evolving regional and global developments. Azerbaijan is once again taking the lead against Islamophobia. For the third year in a row, Baku is hosting an international conference tackling anti-Muslim sentiment. Launched after a UN resolution marking March 15th as the International Day to Combat Islamophobia, the Baku conference has become a key platform for global dialogue. This year, 12 major organisations are taking part. The focus goes beyond faith, addressing modern challenges like AI, digital media and new forms of discrimination.
Cənab Prezidentin İslam dünyası ilə bağlı, İslamofobiya ilə bağlı bəlkə də 60 biz konferansı
In our foreign policy, combating Islamophobia and promoting Islamic unity are key priorities. But it's also important to take practical steps, both at the government level and through think tanks. This is something we've consistently done over the past 3 years. What does this show? It shows that Baku is truly becoming a hub for political and academic dialogue. There's now a growing network, be it scholars or public figures from Europe or the Middle East, who stay engaged even after the conference. Research papers are being written and follow-up contact is maintained.
və müxtəlif düşüncə mərkəzləri tərəfindən
və Bakıdan veriləcək mesaj çox aydındır.
The message from Baku is clear. Together, we intend to take more informed, coordinated and concrete actions. We aim to send a strong message, not only to international organizations, but also to governments and political centers, especially in regions where Islamophobia is alarmingly severe, that these practices must be eliminated. Unfortunately, the situation is worsening. Discrimination is on the rise, and most concerningly, it is being normalized, particularly in countries that claim to uphold liberal values. This is unacceptable to us. That is why we firmly believe the number of supporting organizations will grow in the coming years. Already, many distinguished experts, academics, public figures, and religious leaders are taking part in this conference, each playing a unique and important role.
Armenia will host the European Political Community Summit in 2026, followed by Azerbaijan in 2028. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan announced it on his X account and added that Armenia and Azerbaijan have mutually backed each other's bids to host the summit. This mutual support highlights a notable step towards cooperation between the two neighbours within the framework of the regional forum. Georgia's relationship with the European Union is under fresh strain following a series of political and diplomatic flashpoints. As tensions escalate, the stakes are becoming higher. Our correspondent Nini Nikolaishvili brings us more from Tbilisi.
Relationship between Georgia and the European Union have grown increasingly strained after the tense week in Tbilisi. Opposition leader Zoran Zaparidze was arrested in court on Thursday, the days after an EU mission diplomat was denied to entry into the country. Those moves raised concerns in Brussels about Georgia's political direction. Critics accused the ruling Georgian Dream Party of moving away from democratic norms, with one EU lawmaker comparing Georgia's trajectory to that of Belarus. The government, however, pushed back. Prime Minister Irakli Kobakhidze accused the EU ambassador Pavel Herchinsky of being influenced by political forces hostile to Georgia's leadership. The EU rejected those claims. Foreign Affairs spokesperson Anita Hipper called these accusations completely unfounded and warned that they damage Georgia's EU membership prospects. Amid growing unease, some European officials are calling for the targeted sanctions against Georgian Dream's influential figures, including former Prime Minister Bidzina Ivanishvili. Now the EU is weighing its next step as tensions continue to rise. It's Nini Nikolaishvili reporting from Tbilisi, AnewZ.
Uzbekistan and Slovenia have strengthened their partnership by signing a joint statement and several bilateral agreements in transport, logistics, education, culture and tourism. The two countries agreed to boost trade to €500 million, supported by preferential trade and standardisation deals. Uzbekistan plans to apply Slovenia's expertise in smart city development, launch dual education and student exchange programmes. Industrial cooperation will focus on technology modernisation, green energy and smart agriculture. Turkey is deepening its energy and reconstruction ties with Syria. Ankara has announced it will begin exporting natural gas and dramatically increase electricity exports in the coming months to Damascus. The move comes as part of broader efforts to aid Syria's recovery and boost bilateral cooperation in energy and infrastructure.
Ankara will soon begin natural gas exports to Syria, totaling 2 billion cubic meters annually. The exports are expected to enhance electricity generation in key Syrian regions, including Aleppo and Homs. It's after Turkey and Syria signed a comprehensive framework agreement on cooperation in energy, mining and hydrocarbons on Thursday. Turkey's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources Alparslan Bayraktar made the announcement at a joint press conference with Syrian Energy Minister Mohammed al-Bashir in Damascus.
Biz buraya Halep'e kadar ve Humus'a kadar gelebilecek şekilde yıllık yaklaşık 2 milyar metreküplük.
We have also intensified our efforts regarding natural gas. We will soon begin exporting gas that will reach Aleppo and Homs, providing an additional contribution of approximately 1,300 megawatts of electricity generation in the region, with an annual volume of around 2 billion cubic meters.
Bir yoğun çalışmayı kendileriyle ve ekipleriyle birlikte yürütüyoruz.
The minister pointed out that with the easing of international sanctions, Syria will have access to crucial investment and financing opportunities. Bayraktar added that Turkey is ready to support Syria's development and is committed to working on projects that will improve living conditions for the Syrian people.
Ve son olarak şunu ifade edeyim. Burada bugün birlikte imzaladığımız enerji ve madenler alanında
The framework agreement we have just signed in the fields of energy, mining and carbon resources constitutes an important roadmap for our future cooperation.
Daha farklı anlaşmaları imzalarken bundan sonra daha sık göreceksiniz.
Minister al-Bashir confirmed that the natural gas pipeline extending from Turkey's Kilis district into Syria will become operational by June. He added that Turkish firms will play a central role in the mining and electricity distribution sectors, while joint technical units will be established to further cooperation across various energy domains. This renewed energy partnership marks a significant step in regional diplomacy and infrastructure rebuilding, laying the groundwork for broader economic ties between the two neighboring countries.
Afghanistan is ramping up its climate diplomacy as environmental threats continue to grow across the region. The Director General of Afghanistan's National Environmental Protection Agency held talks with Azerbaijan's Minister of Ecology and Natural Resources to enhance environmental efforts. Our correspondent Tamim Bahis has more from Kabul.
A high-level Afghan delegation from the National Environmental Protection Agency, led by General Director Matiul Haq Khalis, has held a significant bilateral meeting in Russia with Azerbaijan's Minister of Ecology and Natural Resources, Mukhtar Babayev. Minister Babayev welcomed Afghanistan's presence at the 11th International Congress of Novosibirsk, calling it a vital step towards stronger regional cooperation. The Afghan side expressed deep appreciation for Azerbaijan's invitation to last year's COP29 climate conference and requested support for Afghanistan's participation in the upcoming COP30 summit in Brazil. Khalis also called for expanded environmental cooperation between the two countries, including joint projects, memorandums of understanding, and capacity building initiatives. In response, Minister Babayev reaffirmed Azerbaijan's commitment to supporting Afghanistan in key international environmental efforts. Meanwhile, climate concerns at home are growing. A recent Japan Times report warns that Kabul may face critical groundwater shortages by 2030. The report highlights a mix of population pressures, climate-driven drought, and over-extraction, making water sustainability an urgent challenge. As Afghanistan strengthens its environmental ties abroad, the hope is that international cooperation can help address the worsening impact of climate change at home. This is Tamim Bahis in Kabul for AnewZ.
That's all we have for now. Thank you for watching and stay tuned to AnewZ.